Okay, so we'll start back up here. So, I think, unfortunately, I didn't get to see the entirety of the documentary. If you want to look at it again, you can just Google RIP, a Remix Manifesto, and I gave you the manifesto here and have it up on the screen. But, what he's talking about in this film, I think the curious thing is that there's nothing necessarily new about it. If you go back to, and we could come up with hundreds of examples, but artists going back so many years, this is an example of Marcel Duchamp, in a sense, doing his own remix. Many artists, of course, were inspired by not just other artists, but by other cultures. You can look at Picasso and Gauguin and think about how they traveled to Tahiti and Oceania and parts of Africa and try to come back and take some of that inspiration and, if you will, remix it and make it part of their artwork. In this sense, I mean, this is more the traditions, if you know Duchamp's background, more the traditions of the avant-garde. Kurt Schwitters was also shown in that film, A Dadaist, who has a famous sonata in Lauten, which is, you could say, an early mashup for its time of different sounds and symbols and phrases and even languages. And so someone like Duchamp takes the work of Da Vinci, puts a mustache on it, in a sense, makes a statement about art as doing a remix in that sense. He also did what are called ready-mades, where he would take an object like a urinal, and that would become his work of art. So a totally utilitarian, everyday item, and by attaching his name to it and a context of art or aesthetics, creates something entirely new. So what they're talking about in this film is not new. What I think is new is the speed at which a lot of these properties or memes or images or sound sources or files can be shared, so it's more public and participatory, as we talked about with convergence culture and spreadable media. There's also the bigger economic issue. I mean, you think about an artist doing this, and maybe the people involved or the corporations involved are few or minimal or none. In the case of today's music industry, video game industry, film industry, billions and billions of dollars at stake, and if you apply the conflict or critical perspectives from sociology to this, you could say there's a lot of money to be had. And when they interview Lars on the PBS show, I forget the guy's name, but he's very much celebrating the fact, like, yeah, we're going to lose money and we deserve to have this money because we're artists. And certainly there is a line of argument in our society about that, saying, well, why should someone who spends the time in the studio and creatively make something, why should that person be denied? But the opposite of that, of course, is the Lawrence Lessig copyleft movement, which says, well, actually, this should be about sharing. Just as hunter-gatherers would share resources in society for survival, this is our, as he said, our new form of literacy. This is our ability to share information, and government, corporations, or Big Brother, if you go back to actually some of the dystopian literature, should never be allowed to say, you can't do that, you can't share that, you can't remix that. A lot of us would say that creativity begins and ends with remixing. I mean, you can't find a source out there, a film, a song, that doesn't have some reference to something in the past. And it may not be a direct lifting of a particular chord progression or a type of, an actual filmic scene of some sort, a series of scenes, or a camera angle, but there's probably some reference to the past. There's constant citation that goes on in all art, and again, Duchamp would be one example among many, that this is not entirely a new phenomenon, but you could say the stakes are much bigger because of the economics, because of the fact that we can share this stuff more than we could in the past, perhaps. Any, just general comments on the film before we start this? And I'll just go over some of the handout here and talk about some of the big picture issues. But did you find, philosophically, you agreed with this film, the director, the folks in the film? I mean, it certainly is on one side of the argument, right? And we often find this with documentary film, where this is a very pro-copyleft film, saying it's all about sharing, no restrictions, it's creativity. We didn't get to see one of the later scenes about Steamboat Willie and how Disney essentially was remixing old folk tales and stories from the past, and today then basically saying the rest of us can't do that. And that's always an argument to say that the corporations get to do it, but we as individuals can't. And it's kind of ironic because we don't all have teams of attorneys and lawyers and consultants who can protect us if an issue comes up with copyright or whatever. So, but did you generally agree with the perspectives of the film, or found yourself more in the middle, or in your own lives and file sharing and remixing? And not a big...
It seems like he's making two arguments. Like one of them is that people should be allowed to download music for free, right? And then the other one is that people should be allowed to download music for free and then make money off of it, which seemed like, and it seemed like he was kind of trying to push them together, you know, to make them the same argument, but they're not, right? So like that guy Girl Talk, he makes money off of his remixes.
Right, he does.
He sells albums.
Yeah.
And it's like when you're like there's this DJ Cap Slap, right, who kind of does the same thing as Girl Talk. Like he'll take popular songs like Party Rock or whatever and remix them, but then he just releases them for free online, and he doesn't have any problems. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
It's the same way with that guy's YouTube channel. Like you can make lyric videos or you know your little Naruto AMV or whatever with whatever kind of song you want and release it. But then when you let YouTube start putting commercials on your channel, that's when you start having to worry about DMCA takedown notices and like the RIA crawling up your ass.
Yeah.
It seems like, I don't want to say it was disingenuous to like conflate those two things, but they're totally different.
Yeah.
Like monetizing,
right.
You know, there's a difference between, the internet is like a library of all human knowledge versus now I can just take some of that and put it on a CD and then sell it to somebody else.
Right.
That to me kind of like crosses the line.
Yeah.
Because like all my media, all the shows I watch, pretty much I download, you know, illegally because I'm not going to pay for cable when I can just get it for free.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't like take all that stuff I'm downloading and burn it to DVDs and take it to swap meet.
Yeah.
Because then it's I'm kind of defeating the purpose of the whole peer-to-peer file sharing thing. If I'm kind of leeching off of it to make money for myself, then I'm worse than a remixer.
Yeah, I think that's very well stated. In fact, I was almost thinking as you're saying that, like the real argument, right, is this very general notion of freedom. We should have freedom, and then we said, well, what do we define freedom as? Is freedom the freedom to remix something, as you're saying, for personal uses? Put that on YouTube, don't monetize it, but it's an aesthetic form, like the Duchamp. Is freedom that same thing plus the monetizing? Like you're saying, Girl Talk, right, is making money, playing Coachella concerts. I don't know his distribution system. I don't follow his music too much.
Well, what's important too to note is that they didn't really, like the last 3 minutes of the movie, he admits, I do albums and stuff. But the whole rest of the movie, if you don't know anything about this guy, you're basically left to assume, he's just remixing songs for fun on his laptop, and how could they be so mean? And it's like, that's not what's happening. He's a businessman, just like these other guys.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, right, yeah, you bring in the monetary angle and it raises new questions. So like in defining freedom, is it the remixing? Is it the remixing plus making the money? Or is it just, there's also, as you talk about conflation of argument, there's also the sharing argument. It seems to me like you could be a person who downloads, Breaking Bad or whatever your favorite shows are and watches them, and like you're saying, not monetizing that after the fact. But that doesn't make you an artist. And again, when Duchamp was doing these remixes, or any other artists, including Girl Talk, there is an aesthetic side to that. And I think it would be a shame to say, well, because I agree with you, it gets complicated when he's making money. But if you're just, Lars from Metallica saying, you can't do this because that's not my original intent. Well, it's like, well, that's a very anti-freedom of aesthetics and art kind of perspective, because all art has some reference, all poetry, all music, all literature, direct, indirect, subtle, or very clear to us, less so subtle, of the past. It's always about citation, and that's why you could say we've always lived in a remix culture. But you bring in technology, you bring in the social sharing side of it, as we've been talking about, and you bring in the economics of it, totally new monster. An entity where it becomes a legal battle.
Right, it's the difference between citation and plagiarism, right? Because it's like, you can't just, not with any other field could you take something somebody said and just say, oh yeah, that's mine now. And get paid for it, basically.
Right, and but even in there, not so much a plagiarism, but there's a new site that came out recently, a Russian site, Sci-Hub. There's concern about, it's not plagiarism per se, but it's about the control of information. So a lot of journals will, have authors write for their journals. I've written for many of these. But then to buy the article online, it could be 30, 40, 50, even $100 for one little article. So these folks, kind of like in the lines with Lawrence Lessig, said, we're going to create this website, we're going to have tens of millions of articles, people can donate articles to it, and we're just going to all put it up online. Well, it raises an issue. Should that be legitimate? Should it be free access to information? Should there be control of that by corporations? It really speaks to issues outside of this debate, like how much should corporations control our lives? It's like the guy who decided, I'm going to sell this drug, which is a life-saving drug, and I'm going to up my price of the drug by 2,000 or 3,000%. People were really upset about this and said, no, this is not cool, you can't do that. It does also speak then to the limits of corporations and age-old questions about control and even existential issues about how much should our lives be controlled by whom, should we have total freedom, or is it somewhere in between? So I think, a series of issues there to think about. If we go back to, if we even say, and I tend to make it even more general and talk about remaking versus remixing, but in a sense they're doing similar things. We can look at the Oxford English Dictionary, the prefix re, very simply, and find that it's always talking about moving us backwards towards some starting point, a point reached, sending or looking back. Combined with that is a different sense, the again or the action, where we perform something for a second time. And this again is the pure meaning of the prefix re. And so when we look at this prefix, we say it's a bit of both. It's conservative in saying we should go to the past and reference the past and cite the past, as we said. But it's also, I think, more radical in a more liberal sense, saying we should reappropriate something, we should go forward and take it beyond the bounds of the original. And this is where we probably break with people like Lars or people who say, well, no, I never intended that, you can't do this. You can't defame or remix my work because you're going against my intent. And it's kind of like, well, what gives you the right to say that you have an intent or that your intent should matter in a society of more sharing and creativity where we start thinking about, more the notion of a global village of people interconnected and not the tribalistic model. And my argument about this philosophically is to say, like, it's only going to maybe improve relationships between people, between artists, between different time periods. There's a whole argument in the field of poetry about the anxiety of influence, like Bloom, where he talks about the idea that if you're a poet today and you're writing and you create a verse, well, who's to say like someone else didn't write that, and perhaps you never knew that that verse existed and someone's going to accuse you of plagiarism. It reminds me of an old existentialist story I remember reading in German class in high school. And it was about this guy who invented things. So he would invent like a radio or a TV. And he would essentially create a radio or a TV. And someone else, of course, would say, well, but that already exists. And his point was to say, well, no, I didn't know it existed. Or I didn't really know much about how it worked. And I tried to create my own version of that. And that goes back to Bloom's point about the anxiety of influence. If you're a poet or any artist in any field, and you create a scene as a filmmaker, or you write a verse, or you have a scene in a novel, and someone else says, oh, well, that's already been done. Someone already did a scene about a couple in the Caribbean who gets robbed, and this thing happens to them. You say, well, I didn't know that, and I have a different take on it. Or someone else could say, I realize that scene, but I'm going to remix it. And there's a whole tradition, of course, in film, in literature, of redoing what's happened in the past. And so the question becomes, aesthetically, existentially, what's happening when we use this prefix? When we remake something or remix something, are we doing something new? Are we being conservative, or are we being liberal in terms of how we're approaching what's happened in the past? Now, one context of this is the film remake. And of course, film remakes are often much more than film remakes, they're media remakes. We have an interplay with the world of video games, of stuff happening on the internet, and then also what happens in the world of film. But if you just Google film remake, certain images would come up, and then certain text would come up. And typically it's text like these: derivative, cheap, knockoff, predictable, formulaic. And there's a whole line of arguments saying that if you remake a film like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or Rollerball, or whatever, often the argument is the first is the better version of it. And the same thing goes on with film serials, so people will say, well, the first Godfather or the second Godfather, as you start to remake those, or not remake them, but create, a sequel version of those, it becomes more and more derivative. So the argument always seems to be that the remake, at least in terms of films, is inferior to the original. And I should say that that goes back to age-old philosophical questions. Walter Benjamin made the point that in his argument of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility, that when you take art from its original source and site, being in a church, a temple, or maybe an art gallery, and then you're able to reproduce that art through various means. Of course, you could photocopy that today, you could take a picture of something. He said you lose the aura of that original work of art. We talked about Jean Baudrillard, and the same thing, right? He said, in a world of simulations, you can't tell original from copy. So, and this goes back even to Plato, and Plato himself said, there's something about imitation that makes it, the new form, insignificant or less sublime than the previous or original form. To go back to film remakes, you could see so many examples of this, and books, I have one book on this since I study film remakes that is a very old book, actually, before the age of remakes. I think it was written in like the 70s or maybe even the 60s, and it cites like a couple thousand of these examples, and I couldn't put these all up on the screen because so many films have been remade. Often it's like the French version or the Japanese version, and that gets retold in the American version. It's happened with the spaghetti western, with the Kurosawa films, and then later with Star Wars. It's indirect, it's direct. In some cases, like Brian De Palma, when he remade, sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the classic film, Brian De Palma, Psycho, right? When he remade it, he did a scene-by-scene remake of the Hitchcock version. So some are very direct, almost literal versions. Others are much more indirect, where they borrow bits and pieces of it. Others are an update of a classic story for a new age, and the classic example of this is the remaking of the Manchurian Candidate from the Frank Sinatra version and the newer version with, I think it's Denzel Washington, right? He's updating it for the new global age, the evil corporation versus purely evil government. Same principle of the fact that you have a guy who has, turned into a clone, not a clone, but a total robot, say, of the government, of a corporation, become a killing machine, but updated for the times. The same thing goes on with the Invasion of the Body Snatcher films, some of those where we remake them for the new times. So along with a colleague of mine at College of Marin, John Marmich, we did this collection a few years back where we had a series of authors contributing and saying, okay, what's the significance of remakes specific to these genres, the horror, sci-fi, fantasy film? And so we have King Kong in there, we have Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Rollerball. I do some stuff with zombie films and zombie video games, Resident Evil being an obvious example. And we want to look at then what are the stakes of remaking or remixing films. And we try to then argue against those meanings that I stated earlier, which suggest that if you remake a film, it's purely derivative. Instead, we try to say, and John picks this up from, he's an existentialist philosopher, so he picks up the philosophical side and says, you can go back to folks like Kierkegaard and Heidegger and say that there's a philosophy behind this saying, if you have a new form that emerges after a previous form, again, to go back to that prefix re, you're actually having a conversation between the different forms. And it's kind of cool, the film, I'm forgetting, it's very noirish, it takes place in New England, and it's Robert De Niro, the really creepy guy, forgetting the name of that. Remember that film?
What's it about?
It's like he kind of comes into the life of the family, and he kind of makes their life a hell.
I know you're talking about Hitcher.
Not Hitcher, no. Similar to that. What's the name of that? Anyway, there was a previous version of that film. We can look it up later. But what's cool is when they release the new version of the film, they actually bundle it in a lot of cases with the old version, the black and white. And so what they were deliberately saying is, look, we realize that in remaking this film, we're trying to reference like an earlier version and have dialogue with that. Peter Jackson did this with King Kong a little bit, where he tried to reference earlier ones. He even did it with, it's either Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and I think The Hobbit series is much more forgettable. But he had looked at an animated version, I think it was the second, maybe it was The Two Towers. And he even then wanted to pay homage to it a little bit and say, I'm going to have a scene and I'm going to shoot it kind of like they shot it in the animated feature, which prior to Peter Jackson, was really the only version we had of those classic Tolkien texts. So by doing homage, by bundling films together, by making that available, you're suggesting, as we argue, I think in a lot of the chapters in this book, that it's more about dialogue and it's not about just cheap derivative forms. Now, there are remakes or remixes of the sort. Uwe Boll is an example of a German director who has gotten money from the German government and has done really bad adaptations of classic video games and then has made films based on these, and he typically gets attacked for doing what is called derivative work. But that could be more of the nature of aesthetics and filmmaking and even budget than necessarily something that should be faulted to this particular, and I would argue very provocative form of the film remake. So we're trying to say in here that film remakes are complex, ambiguous, and multifaceted, not just from the get-go derivative and cheap and lacking creativity. My clicker's being weird here. Okay, try that again. And this is very simple, but I think in a lot of studies of remaking, what we could say is there's a version and then there's a new version, and it's a process of interpretation that goes on as these versions are told and retold. Note I'm not saying original, because by saying original, I would be suggesting there's one form that started it all. I don't think you could ever do that, right? You could say, well, the first version of King Kong was the first version of King Kong. Well, to what extent does that go back to Beowulf or other classic tales that weren't told in film but were still told? So we can probably avoid getting into that original and copy, because the original and copy, I think, suggests that it's a very cut and dry formulaic thing that goes on when you remix or remake, as opposed to saying it's one version, a previous version, and new versions, and so forth. As I said earlier, you can look to indigenous cultures and this French word bricolage, which means basically a form of remixing, where you take certain forms, you combine them together and make a new form. Basically, you could say that going back to many indigenous societies, they've been involved in this. Indigenous cultures have been involved in this. The difference tends to be, and this goes back to the point that Joe was making, it gets wrapped up in complex economic, cultural, and media systems, right? It's one thing to say, I'm going to remix, or I'm going to create bricolage art, and I'm going to combine the bottle caps and stuff like this. Probably not going to be the case that Coca-Cola is going to sue you for doing that. Now, the Lego artist, there's a very famous guy who's a Lego artist, and he creates these incredibly complex Lego structures. I think the Lego company has discovered they could use that, in a sense, for a bit of marketing. But the difference would be that if you're doing bricolage art versus you're a girl talk or someone who's making money off this, or you have a big audience for your work, you're wrapped up in these very complex economic, cultural, and media systems, as opposed to doing it as something that's integrated in the fabric of your life. And I'm sort of, this is not as cut and dry as it seems, but I want to make the point that with bricolage art, with indigenous societies, it could be something natural that you just do. And there's many cultures around the world that basically remix and remake. It could be architectural forms, it could be forms of material culture, it could be art. And that's part of their life. It's not necessarily part of their pure economic, cultural, media systems or technological systems, as we talk about with contemporary societies. So I would say once you get it into the venue of a contemporary society, what happens is all of a sudden it's no longer just about the art, as we said earlier, but it's about who makes money off of it, or who gets the rights to remix it, and in what technological forms. Can it be shared? Can it be shared freely, or does someone have to pay for it? Those issues create much more profound forms of dialogue and debate that we have to have. Again, going back to we're not going to go through all these, but going back to the avant-garde versions of this, you had plagiarism in poetry, you had montage where people would take an earlier form, remix it with another form. So the avant-gardes, I think, tell us that it really is about remixing. And then getting more contemporary, we've talked in the past about fan fiction and slash. So I can rewrite Spock and Kirk as gay lovers in Star Trek films or Star Trek novels, and that's a new form of remixing. That may go against the original version, but what it says is we're allowing the fans, the people who are actually working with this stuff on an everyday basis, and some fans are extreme about this, as we learned with Barbara Adams and others in the world of Star Trek fandom, but nonetheless, we're saying they have the opportunity to create the form sort of from the bottom up. They're the ones creating it, remixing it, creating new meanings, and perhaps corporations and other authors will respond in kind. They may not like it, but it's an opportunity to say the fans themselves are part of that remixing or remaking. So as we talk about the urges of this, we could say there's that conversational urge. Going back to fans, there's a co-experience urge. So we can do it together. We can experience it together and remix it together. The pedagogical urge, it teaches us something about previous forms. If I give to you, was it Point Break? Is that something?
That just got remade.
Is that the one? No, is that the one I'm thinking of? But you know, to go back to that film where you have the original and the newer version bundled together on DVD or on the internet, that suggests there's dialogue and education going on about how the times have changed and how filmmaking has changed since the last version was there. Now, we'll talk a little bit about if it's a makeover show or if I say to someone, you should get remade as a person, that could be a different urge, that could be more a conformist urge. So sometimes we remake ourselves or we remake films because we think, oh, the only way to make money is to tell the same old stories again and again. Or the only way for me to fit in is if I buy my clothes from The Gap or Urban Outfitters or whatever, because I want to really fit in, so I'm going to remake who I am. And a lot of those remake shows are about this, and I think they're pretty unfortunate, because that's a different urge than that creative aesthetic urge that we often talk about. And that goes along with the effervescence. The chapter talks about this in our text. You know, we can tie ourselves together as communities of people who work with the same material. We could be artists on the internet remixing similar genre of music. We could be people who are interested in using video game images to remake and retell stories together. So there's an urge of a social community. And then there's a critical urge there. I think that copyleft movement is speaking to this. We want to take down the barriers of society. We want to take down the barriers of economics and corporate and technological media control, such that we allow everyone in society the opportunity to use things freely. This also falls into the realm of communities and architecture. People are applying open source arguments to say all software should be open source. And a lot of this is the case. I mean, one of the sources I use, Handbrake, to take videos like this and to convert them into usable file formats for Final Cut Pro is Handbrake. And Handbrake's totally free. I download it. I can't get in trouble. And it's really functional. GIMP is an example of software that if you don't want to spend a lot of money on Adobe Photoshop, you can download GIMP for free in multiple formats, you know, different operating systems. Folks are then saying, let's make open source architecture and open source furniture so that we can very simply tell people with commonly available materials through bricolage, making their own desk or making their own housing structure such that it's affordable and they don't have to have a lot of money to do that. So there is that democratic and critical urge I think is a big part of certain forms of remaking, particularly when we get into open source moving beyond technology. And again, a lot of these shows that focus on remaking, you know, we're going to fix your face, we're going to make you different, or we're going to, if you watch John Taffer's show, I don't have it up here, but John Taffer's show, Bar Rescue, which is kind of more about the drama of yelling at bad business owners. But part of that show often is to say, you have a tired theme or a tired space, and we're going to remake it or remix it or whatever. So there are psychological effects of remaking that can range from empowerment to nostalgia, confusion to creativity, connection to alienation. Depends on the context, depends on the person, depends on the situation. But I found a lot of these shows that say, we're going to fix you, or we're going to fix your failing space. They miss it a little bit because they suggest a very non-complex, cut and dry approach to fixing your body, making you look right, or fixing your house, or fixing your bar, in the case of some of these shows. There's also rebranding that we've talked about that can go on, or remaking in terms of a political party. You know, people have tried this with the campaign of Hillary Clinton. With Donald Trump right now, I don't think a lot of people can make sense of what's going on with this campaign. But when brands do it, often, you know, the attempt is to say, we have to keep up with the times. McDonald's in today's day and age, Taco Bell in today's day and age, is doing this with their products, doing this with their menu, culinary choices, and also with their spaces, as they're trying to make them cooler or hipper to compete with Starbucks and other places. And you know, for any of these cases, we could see the different appeals here. It could be novelty, You know, the old version is you know, one version is good, but the new version is better. It could be overcoming. You know, in the past you couldn't do something, today now you can. So it's interesting to talk about how there's an appeal to the past, what that appeal to the past means, and how we remake that in the present. Whether it's a political party, a brand, or even a person. I won't go through all these, but there's different values of remaking, ranging from nostalgia and loss and forgetting to newness, homogeneity and control. And in laying this out, I'm sort of suggesting, maybe in some ways relative to our discussion with the film, that it's not cut and dry. It's not just like, okay, it's a great thing to remix. What does it mean to remix? You have to look at the context, you have to look at the person, you have to look at the place, you have to look at the technology, the economics of it, and the art form that is involved, and what is really going on. So it's probably impossible to take a position. On the one side, if we have Lawrence Lessig, it's all copy left. On the other side, it's Lars, Metallica's famous drummer, saying, no, it's all about the rights of the corporation, the record label, or the artist or band. It's probably somewhere in between, and that's going to vary based on what we're trying to do and accomplish, right? There's a big difference between saying we should all just be able to download shows for free and let's have the ability to remix stuff on the internet such that we can increase the different versions of the film, of the media source, the video game, or whatever. So it really does depend on the context, and it's probably somewhere in between those extremes that we might talk about. As we think about remaking and remixing, different issues to consider. We've covered some of these already. There's the political and power issues. Who gets the right to say what we can remake or remix? There's the economic issues. If Girl Talk is doing this and making money off of it, is that an issue? Does the economic side of it change the dynamic? And I would say, along with Joe, that it probably does. There's the cultural issue of how this relates to the culture itself. Again, the difference between the indigenous society doing this and the contemporary society doing it. There are aesthetic issues. There are issues of dialogue and voice. The one previous film speaking to the new previous film, or the earlier poem speaking to the later poem or poet. There are psychological and personal versions of this again. When we remix or remake, whether it's our bodies or the media or art forms that we are familiar with. There's history and memory, there's the technological stuff. And the technological one is probably key because we can both share remixing and remaking on the internet, and we have the ability to do it in the first place, right? It's pretty easy for anyone to take any number of photos and put those together as a collage. Years ago, maybe it was a little harder for you to do this in an aesthetic sense. And then likewise, it's not too hard to do this with forms like music. I showed you in a previous class, Trent Reznor having files that you could download to remix some of his work and also the work of Nine Inch Nails. So technology and media is a big part of this. The social side of it is key too, because I think it does create possibilities for collaboration between different people, perhaps across ethnic, cultural, socioeconomic, political lines. And then lastly is the use. What can we say about remaking from the side of context and use? How's it being used, and what does that say about the dimensions of remaking or remixing? And I guess to kind of circle back to the remix, manifesto, and to say, well, if everything today is a remix, and going along with their film, we might say that, there's a democratic side of this. It's participatory, it's accessible, it's creative, it's social, it's potentially revolutionary, and also it's dialogic. And then when you start thinking about a remix worldview, what you say is, okay, if in the past you have open source versus that traditional source. In the past, corporations and elites controlled stuff. Today, very libertarian in a sense, individuals, the copyleft control stuff. Single authors in the past, today you have multiple authors. They have apps online where you could co-create poems, you could co-create a novel, and that suggests that there could be multiple authors. The folks that made the RIP Remix Manifesto, you can go online today, you could download the source files, you can remix those and upload them to this very participatory website. So it's suggesting we have multiple authors. We're moving from proprietary sourcing in technology and software. You have to have the code, or you have to have the key literally to plug in, or the number to authorize your software. If it's open source, like GIMP and Handbrake, everybody can use it regardless of how much money they have. So proprietary versus open source. State controlled towards more democratic and mobile. hierarchical to recombinatory. It gets kind of philosophical here. The aesthetics of originality to the aesthetics of deconstruction and simulation. The monolithic meaning to the intertextual meaning, and then something that is organic to something being saturated. So what this suggests is that remaking, remixing is not only going to change how we approach technology and art, but it's going to change ourselves, it's going to change our politics. Cory Doctorow had a point in the film saying basically, if we could mobilize this towards more political and progressive ends, that potentially could be the future of where some of this stuff is headed. And what we'll do next time then is talk about consumer and pop culture as a form of resistance and culture jamming. So we'll build a little bit on this material and say the next step is how do we use some of these pop culture, consumer, and technological forms to not just change ourselves, but change our political systems, change the world in the process of all this remixing and remaking.